The way a crow shook down on me the dust of snow from a hemlock tree has given my heart a change of mood and saved some part of a day I had rued. Robert Frost. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank you all for joining me this week. If you're a newcomer, welcome. And if you're a returning listener, thank you as always. I appreciate your support. Newcomers, please be sure to check our backlog of episodes. And I'd ask everyone to like, favorite, rate 5 stars, download, all that kind of good stuff on whatever platform you listen to me on. Now this week's episode is going to be a little shorter. I've had a lot of problems recording today. The update to Audacity has played hell. It keeps crashing every time I try to export. So I rolled back an update I just did, and it looks like it's working a little bit better now. I'm not sure what's going on with that, but I've recorded this episode before, and it was a little bit longer. But like I said, as I was trying to export it, I keep running into this error. So due to how late it is for me, it is past 12 here in my time zone, and I have work in the morning, so I'm just going to cover a little bit of North America between the years of 6 and 4000 BC, BCE, whichever of those two dating systems you prefer, even though they're technically the same. But yeah, so I'm going to just kind of cover parts of North America, a shorter segment of what I had initially recorded. The next week, I'll get back and kind of record the rest. So apologies. There also will not be any pictures or anything included on the YouTube episode this week because, again, it's late. I've got to get this thing in the can and export it and just set for upload and get to bed. So apologies for that, guys. Thankfully, this first section, I don't think I'd have too much to show you anyway. So, that does kind of work out well. Now, for those that may not remember or who may not have listened to our talking about the populations in the Americas last season, of course, with the rising sea level, one of my theories, and it's not just mine, but it's one that I do believe to be the case. With the sea level rising, I think a large portion of early Homo sapien occupation of the Americas are probably underwater. And that has thrown, some difficulties in dating everything, at least at these very early periods. Of course, by the time we get to this season, we have a much clearer picture of who is living where and how they're kind of spreading out along North and South America. Now, we're going to start where we always start when we get to the Americas. That is the way that the first Homo sapiens arrived in the Americas, and that is going via the Bering Land Bridge through what is now Alaska and down into modern-day Canada and the continental U.S., and then, of course, down from there. Though, of course, as we said, sea levels are more or less what they'll be today. So that land bridge is underwater. However, that does not mean that there's not any islands or anything that humans could spread out along. In fact, the ancestors of the modern-day Inuit peoples, where we get the Aleutian Island name from, are probably beginning to occupy the Aleutian Islands. Their ancestors were probably part of the last major wave of migration from Asia into North America. And they had probably stayed, what is now mainland Alaska, since that crossing until right about now where they are beginning to spread out of there. Of course, there is a slight increase in temperature in the region like there is in Europe, although Europe temperature increase is much higher than it is in this area, but it is still more hospitable in this region during this time period, which probably led to this breakup, or not necessarily a breakup, but it led to several waves of migrations of the ancestors of the Aleut, as well as their cousins, into different parts of the Americas. Though I do want to stress that they are not entirely abandoning they are not completely abandoning Asia. There are a couple of these groups that do have people still living in what is now Russia, though these are very small numbers. And these are not easy trips between, across the Bering Sea, but it does happen still, at least in small numbers. Today, the Aleut, actually, Aleut is a Russian term. It is not the endonym that the Alouets give themselves. They use the term, depending on which dialect of their language. They have an Eastern and Western language. It's either Unangan or Unangas. Unangas is the Eastern variety, and Unangan is the Western variety. Now, there are not many Aleut in Russia. I think there's less than 500 from what I saw, and that's from that was back in the 2012s. I can't imagine their numbers would have gone up much more than that. Whereas in the U.S., still not a huge population, but I think as of 2020, I think they were listed as having about between 6,500 and 7,000 members of various Aleut tribes. And I think the U.S. government recognizes 13 different Aleut tribes. And in terms of people speaking their languages, I think there's only about 150 people in the U.S. that are, I guess, considered fluent. And in Russia, that number is it's in the single digits. Very endangered language, unfortunately, or at least it has been recorded, so that is something. But in terms of people who actually are speaking it, it's not very widely spoken. Of course, it is not a distinct language at this point of our history. It is still the language being spoken by these several groups of hunter-gatherer fishers, which is the lifestyle that all of these people are speaking as they're making their way along the Arctic Circle and the Alaskan seaboard and the Kamchatka seaboard. They are speaking what is referred to as Proto-Eskaleut, or at least that's what they will be speaking towards the end of our season, right around 4000 BC. Of course, prior to that, they are speaking Proto-Eskaleut, most likely. And that names, of course, comes from the combination of Eskimo and Aleut, although, of course, Eskimo is kind of not a term that many people use much anymore because it is considered derogatory. And we'll get into that, in future episodes. But it is also sometimes referred to as the Proto-Inuit-Yupik-Unangan language, which of course is the precursor to the modern language family, which again is sometimes referred to as Eskaleut or Eskimo-Aleut or Inuit-Yupik-Unangan. Now, this language family as a whole is a bit of a mystery. There have been attempts by several ethnolinguists to kind of connect this to various other language families without success. Some are just crackpot theories. I think Joseph Greenberg, of all people, suggested that it should be put in the language families of like Northern Eurasia, kind of like Uralic, Altaic, Korean, like tie all the Northern Eurasian families together, like Indo-European with Uralic and Altaic and Korean. Obviously, that's going so far back that's impossible. It's also, from what archaeologically we can tell, as well as just genetically, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But again, that's an earlier kind of attempt at organization prior to the advent of DNA. So a little bit less on that. But then there have been others that tried just to connect it to Uralic, which is its own Finno-Uralic. Maybe they broke off somewhere in Siberia, 15,000 years, somewhere in that range. But again, most of those are kind of just not accepted at any level because the reconstructions are impossible to make. Now, there have been some more recent ones trying to connect their languages to some of the indigenous peoples to their south. I think the Wakashan languages, which are a group of languages spoken on the Victoria Island in Western Canada, around where kind of to the north and the coast along where modern day Vancouver is. But that hasn't been firmly established. But that was originally proposed back in the 60s, and there have been some stuff, I think, in the early 2000s that have kind of tried to test that, and at least it hasn't been disproven. So it's possible that the Wakashan peoples were maybe like an early group that broke away from the Proto-Eskaleut and made their way south much earlier. But again, that's just theory. And there are other theories trying to connect the Wakashan with other language groups, though some of those have been disproven, but then some haven't. So it's all kind of jumbled up. So we'll talk about some of the Wakashan people later on. Now, aside from the ancestors of the Aleut, the Eskimoan branch of the Eskaleut, or the Yupik and Inuit branch of the languages. Of course, these are people. Apologies for the cut there. The emergency vehicles are flying down the road at, again, pushing 1:30 here, or 12:30, excuse me. So apologies for the quick cut. This includes the ancestors of the Inuit as well as the Yupik, both of whom are mostly located in Canada, though again, the Yupik do have some of their languages spoken in what is now Russia. There is also another branch that has since gone extinct that's not included in the Inuit-Yupik version of the language family name, and this is the Saranac. That language went extinct in the late 1990s. Those were I think they all were spoken in what is now Russia, though there may have been one or two small outposts kind of in what is now like the very far reaches of Alaska, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. And I should point out, some of the Aleut languages have gone extinct too. I think a couple of their western and central dialects have, or at least no one's speaking them. I think they've all been recorded, but I think it was Ottawan and the Bering branches of their dialects are no longer spoken. Now, again, that the Proto-Eskaleut language is being spoken at the very least by the end of our season, or at least the version of the language that will eventually give birth to the rest of these language families is being spoken right around 4000 BC, probably at least a few hundred years earlier than that, if not longer. And it will continue to be spoken up until about 2000. But as that's happening, more of these groups are going to break off and establish their own separate languages and language families. Aleut does appear to have broken off first, and that's probably because the people who will eventually be speaking that language do begin to move into what are now the Aleutian Islands. Whereas the Eskimoan branch, they are mostly in Canada, though some do make their way to Greenland, and then some do continue to reach back into Asia. But the Eskimoan branch includes Saranac, Yupik, and Inuit, and each of those has their Inuit and Yupik have their own distinct languages under those. Saranac did not. They did not really have the numbers to compete with the other language families spoken in that area. And we'll cover more of that later. Now, it's important to remember that the people speaking the Proto-Eskaleut, they're not the only peoples living in this part of the Americas. There are other groups that had come across the land bridge earlier than them, who had been living, in what is now Canada and the Arctic Circle earlier. And by and large, there's a lot of overlap in terms of how these people live, just because, due to the weather and the environment, there's only so much you can do to kind of differentiate yourselves, at least in terms of economy. Now, you do have different types of tool-making traditions, artistic expression, and of course language would also be a marker of distinction between all these groups. Of course, this far back, it's hard to kind of nail down some language stuff because, some of these languages were not spoken by the time people were writing this sort of thing down. And we only have either, oral tradition to go on, or we have no tradition to go on. Now, we've talked about both the impressive ability of oral tradition to keep some facts and things that are true alive, but there's also some things that it does not necessarily do a great job of kind of keeping track of, and we've talked about that before in earlier episodes. But just keep in mind that the Proto-Eskaleut or the Eskaleut ancestors are not the only people living in this area, but they're all kind of grouped under an umbrella term known as the Paleo-Arctic, and that's again, it's not a cultural. It's not like a culture the same way that we've talked about, material cultures in Asia and Europe. It's a tradition. It's a collection of several small cultures that just kind of occupy the same general area. And because of their environment, they may have more in common, materially speaking, than they have differences, at least, again, materially speaking. Culturally, religiously, linguistically, that stuff doesn't show up in the archaeological record, or at least doesn't show up as clearly. So, what did these people have in common? How were they living? Well, again, they were hunters, gatherers, and fishers. Of course, agriculture is being, developed in the Americas during this period. However, it is much further south, and of course, this area, due to the nature of the winters and just weather patterns in general, not, of course, very conducive to agriculture, even if it did exist in the area. Though that is not to say that they did not make use of local plants. They probably found every use that every plant around them could be used for, and quickly. Of course, that would include any kind of medicinal properties, use for food, cooking, creating baskets. Basket weaving is a big part of a lot of traditions in the Americas. Different basket weaving traditions come up in terms of what kind of plants are used. I know the Inuit use lime grass, from that grows along the sea to create their baskets. So any and all plants that they could use, they would. And if they're living along the rivers and the sea, of course, they're making use of seals, walrus, salmon, especially considering how close they are to a lot of spawning fields. Salmon's probably a very big part of their diet. Oil from seal blubber and things like that be used for lamps and heating. And the type of stone tools they're making are designed to optimally harvest those type of animals. A lot of barbed points and things like that for fishing and sealing, and I'm sure eventually whaling too. I'm not quite sure when they first started whaling, but that is a tradition in a lot of the kind of the Pacific Northwest and parts of Alaska as well too. I believe that whaling took place. Of course, being hunter-gatherers, they're probably following a very traditional pattern of living for hunter-gatherers. That means, during the spring and the summer and the more mild parts of fall, they're probably living in very small units, maybe just a nuclear family, or maybe, one or two brothers, their wives and children, all kind of hunting and fishing and gathering. And then during the winter, they would congregate with extended family, maybe a first cousin or two, and their children. And then they would live in the winter all communally to kind of, help search for food if it was needed, or to kind of share various stockpiles of resources that they've gotten, as well as to, help educate the next generation. I imagine you had a lot of downtime in the winter during that period, and I know at later periods, some of the tribes in that time do develop, specific, I wouldn't say institutions, but they do they have communal housing together where they are educating the children in the various aspects of their lifestyle, what they'll be required to do one day when they enter adulthood. And I think some of these are, based on gender. One structure is to teach the boys, the other is to teach the women, or the young girls. And, that's not to say they didn't, congregate men and women during this period. I think there are some instances of some of the Inuit people, digging subterranean passageways between the two structures so that to help them stay warm. That's probably a pattern that's extremely old and was happening even before they developed like these larger communal buildings. We have found, clusters of kind of tent foundations, like these stone rings, kind of dating back to this period and later, where, you could see that, there were several tents all kind of organized together, and then they would leave and come back, seasonally, as needed. Some homes were kind of dug down to be kind of semi-subterranean. That helps it keep warm and dry, which is extremely important given the environment. Of course, special kinds of coats made from seal fur would be very important for staying dry as well. They used bird feathers or bird skin as well to kind of help make their coats, kind of help waterproof them. They would use sea mammal intestines, things like walrus, I think dolphins, as well as whales. Though again, I'm not quite sure when the whale hunting tradition started, but I know eventually some homes would be made with whale bones serving as kind of the outline of the domicile, and then they would, of course, stretch leather or other types of skins or other coverings over the bones to kind of use the bones as a structure. So they had a very wide variety of housing, basically depending on where they're camping. Very, very versatile. Now, in terms of burial, they were equally as versatile. several of these tribes have different types of burial practices. There's not one that seems to stand out among any of the others, at least from the ones I was reading about. Now, there could be very specific traditions for some tribes, but I didn't see any, anyone that's used across every tribe, in the area. Some would do mummification, though that's very rare. Some would do burying their dead in kind of a stone, like sarcophagi, basically like creating dolmens, essentially. Some were just buried with grave goods under or very near their villages. And these practices change over time. I'm sure that there's a lot of different periods where one style is more common. But in these earliest periods, unfortunately, we haven't found too many examples to go by. But even in later periods where we have more examples, there's a lot of different examples to go by. So they had a very rich, I guess, spiritual life in terms of how they celebrated their dead. There's not any one thing that they had to stand by necessarily. Cave burials were another option. Sometimes that they would kind of place them on like the edge of bluffs, kind of overlooking kind of a range. So a lot of different burial locations and practices across all these different people's ranges. Now, I debated in my last recording about including more religious specifics about either the Aleut or the Inuit or the Yupik peoples, but I decided not to include that, and the reason for that is we have a very wide selection of Inuit and Yupik myths and that kind of thing that are written down, but I decided not to include them because I think it's still a little early. Now, I'm not saying that they weren't telling some of these stories at this period. I'm not saying that they weren't even telling, versions of those stories at this period. But it doesn't mean they were either. And there are other peoples who we'll talk about in future, or I should say other cultures that we'll talk about in the future that I know are living in the same area as these people. And I don't feel like just covering the one because I feel like it erases the other people that are going to be living there. Specifically, one of those is known as the Dorset culture. And we'll get into this more detail later. But essentially, they're not the only people living there. I feel like when we get an episode on these cultures as like an individual, kind of an individual subject, then I'll dive more into their kind of specifics. And I've tried to do that when I can. That's why I did, Egyptian mythology because, well, that's kind of where the Proto-Egyptians are, as far as we know, that it was just the Egyptians living there, and kind of the same thing with the Sumerians. So make of that what you will. But and the thing with, kind of similar to China, we know that there were, various peoples living in what is now China, even to a later period, but their kind of traditions are at least partially written down. So I just wanted to wait a little bit longer, but very interesting cosmology among the Inuit and the Yupik. They have got some really interesting gods and goddesses and spirits, and they kind of have their own version of shamanism, which is very similar to parts of Siberia, where they migrated from and probably migrated back to, and then back into the Americas. We talked about that a little bit, I I think 2 seasons ago. It was either last season or the season before. I can't remember. But they kind of developed their own form of shamanism, but then they also developed deities, though they're not deities the same way the Egyptians or the Greeks or the Romans would understand them. So, but I think that will do it here for tonight. Sorry, this is a rougher episode. I know I'm forgetting some stuff I covered in the first recording, and I'll try to pull it back out of the ether. But I appreciate you all for listening regardless. Again, sorry this one's so rough. I hope you enjoy it. And we'll be back next week with, we'll continue kind of down south from there into the rest of the Americas. And then we'll hit South America, and then, we'll be progressing on to next season. And then I'll talk eventually about how I'm kind of reorganizing everything. Because I think the seasons work kind of for prehistory, but now that we're moving in actual history, I think we kind of need to reorganize stuff. But it will still be like an overall view, and we'll still go like, region by region, because I feel like that's kind of easy to do. But anyway, that's all stuff for the future. But again, I do appreciate you all for joining me this week again. Apologies for the rough version of this episode. And apologies to my YouTube viewers that there will not be any kind of, pictures. Again, there's not a whole lot I was going to show anyway, just because, again, a lot of the artifacts are from a later period in history that I was able to find. And again, there's no way to tell that these cultural identities were even conceived of at that point. So that's why I'm not kind of including those or the mythology stuff. But if you have any comments, questions, constructive criticism, please let me know. You can reach me via email at waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can also contact me via direct message on X/Twitter. And comment on the YouTube episode as well. We're almost to 400, I think. We're like 397, 398, something like that. But I appreciate you all, and we will see everyone next time. Peace.